Welcome back, everybody. In this next session, we are very privileged to have some of the world's top economic minds who've been focusing on this region. A lot of expertise on Kazakhstan and Central Asia. And what we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes is Kazakhstan's economy after oil, taking a regional context. What could be next? What are the areas to focus on? And what are the developments that might influence what types of investments businesses want to make? Joining me up here on stage, very pleased to have Darren Acemoglu from the Department of Economics at MIT, one of the world's foremost economic thinkers, and publication record longer than the road between Astana and Almaty. We also have Eric Bergloff, ex-chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now at the Institute for Global Affairs at the London School of Economics, and also Antonio Somma, who is the director of the Eurasia Competitiveness Program at the OECD. Darren, if we can just begin with you. I mean, a lot of your academic research has been on institutions and development and the kind of processes that lead countries to undergo economic growth and transitions. What are the lessons from your research that you would want to pass on to Kazakhstan?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kazakhstan is at a critical juncture right now, as are many of the other sort of natural resource-based economies. If you look at Kazakhstan, there's already sort of a modern core. It's a middle-income country, but the economy is very much dependent on natural resources. So, with the volatility of natural resource prices, the inability to sort of generate high value added in related sectors, and the drop in the price of oil, of course, everybody is looking at diversification. And diversification is key, but what I would like to point out is that I think just focusing on diversification would be the wrong strategy. Why? Because I think what Kazakhstan needs, and what many of the other natural resource-based economies need, is what, broadly speaking, could be called inclusive growth. Growth based on productivity improvements, technological change, high value added, and all of these, of course, necessitate a bottom-up participation in economic activity. In other words, people building their own human capital, their own technology base, their own know-how, in order to create technological improvements, niche products, comparative advantage for the economy. But when you actually think of diversification, it's a somewhat of a different process. If you look at the late 19th century or most of the 20th century, there have been many other examples of economies that were dependent on natural resources that have tried to diversify. But the natural instinct of most politicians and government structures, when they already start from an economy that's hierarchical, that's based on a single sector under government control, is to kickstart that process of economic diversification in a similar manner. So you see, for example, in 19th century Mexico, there is suddenly a drive to move out of agriculture and natural resources into industry. How does that take place? It takes place by the then autocrat Porfirio Diaz saying, okay, I am declaring these entrepreneurs the monopolies of textiles, monopolies of cement, monopolies of machinery, and then you have a very monopolistic, not very efficient, not very productivity growth-based industrialization process that neither contributes to long-run economic growth nor brings the other important bulwark of inclusive economic growth, which is shared prosperity. And then the same experience is repeated in Argentina, it's repeated in Brazil, it's repeated in the parts of the Middle East throughout the 20th century. So, looked at it from that point of view, I would say the priority is not so much diversification, which should which would take place, for example, in a natural manner with big firms that have the support of the government, but creating an environment which includes both an economic environment and a political environment in which a more broad-based participation in economic activity can take place. And that really needs to rely on what are generally the mainstays of inclusive economic growth, incentives for the common people, not just people who are connected to the government or who have already come to important places, and opportunities that are broadly based in society so that people can take part in these economic activities. So there are certain encouraging signs in Kazakhstan for that. One is that it's already a relatively speaking, compared to other Central Asian countries, more sort of equitable distribution of human capital. And then the other sort of enabling factor here is to have a state capacity. You know, you cannot have this sort of inclusive growth that I'm talking about if you don't have functioning courts, infrastructure, an education system, a regulatory environment. All of these things are developing in Kazakhstan, but then there are other aspects of inclusive economic growth that really need to be sort of developed. And that includes a more vibrant bottom-up participation process, both in politics and the economy, and also sort of a business environment that has an arm's length relationship with politics and bureaucracy, so that not everything sort of takes place in the context of the control of the government or the wishes of the government, because I think if you're going to be creating these sort of new opportunities for the Kazakh economy, you need to mobilize the creativity, the talents of a broader set of people than just those who sort of have the political power in society. Okay, I'll just stop there.
Okay, so for a country like Kazakhstan that has had a very top-down approach to economic development in the past, obviously there are some sort of rigidities and challenges in moving from that to a place where things are more inclusive. That path presumably has a lot of potential for instability. Do you have any case studies in mind for countries that have sort of successfully made that transition from a top-down to a bottom-up system of economic governance?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very important question, and you've put your finger on both a centrally important aspect for the long-run success of Kazakhstan and a major fear of all sort of politicians when they make such a transition. And I think I certainly don't want to belittle that sort of stability issue, because we've seen in the Middle East, for example, or parts of Africa, or even in Latin America, how the process of political and economic change can spin out of control, and the instability that it brings could be very costly for long-run economic development. On the other hand, too much emphasis on stability would of course be stifling also. Stability is often the buzzword for doing nothing and keeping the status quo, and often the status quo doesn't work. So I think it's a very difficult path to sort of chart at the end of the day, and I don't think there is a very clear sort of recipe that countries can apply. Singapore has certainly been able to build much greater state capacity than pretty much anywhere else in Asia, has been able to build a very well-functioning legal system without leading to any sort of instability, but still the top-down approach has sort of persisted. On the other hand, you have the examples that come from, say, European development in the 19th century, where stability was not as much of a controlled process, but at the end, sort of things have generally worked out. Whether that was luck or not, that's a different question. But if you look at the sort of the British experience, for example, in the 19th century, or the Swedish experience in the early 20th century, you have a lot of instability for short periods of time, but the general political environment gains strength as a result of being able to withstand those challenges, and ultimately creates a more sort of organically bottom-up process for both political participation and economic participation. I guess in the 20th century, the sort of the mixture case is South Korea, especially after the fall of its military regime, has been generally able to maintain a broadly stable political environment, but with sort of important crises, both economic and political. But I think if you look at the overall development of the South Korean economy, it has achieved something that would have been pretty difficult had it not really made that transition to a more open political system and a more gradually open economic system, especially after the East Asian crisis. So therefore, I think in terms of bullet points, what I would say is that stability is very important, but the way to sort of ensure stability is to create the institutional environment, such as a legal system, a flexible conflict resolution institutions, both within and outside parliamentary institutions within the country, that are going to be able to withstand the challenges rather than try to control the whole process from top down, which would of course bring some degree of stability unless it collapses entirely, but would then not really enable the more organic economic and political development process.
Yeah, possibly one of the key challenges for Kazakhstan in this transition. Eric, if we can move on to you. So you have a background with the EBRD and now in an academic sense at the LSE. Taking that international perspective, what do you think are the challenges or the next steps for Kazakhstan in this transition? I'm especially interested if you have any thoughts on the upcoming privatization program, which really could be a critical part of that.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I'm very sympathetic to what Daron has, the sort of analysis that he has given here. And as you said, I spent a lot of time looking at the EBRD region, but one of the privileges of my new job is that I can look at this region also from the outside. So I spent a lot of time in China and India, and of course, this region looks very different if you look at it from China and also to some extent from India. And when we're looking at the challenges, I think one can say that there are sort of three main challenges that comes up throughout the region actually, but is particularly strong in Kazakhstan perhaps. So the first one is the middle income trap. That's sort of the dominating paradigm of the challenge that you hear in China, in India, and in almost throughout Asia and certainly a lot in other parts of the world. So that is remarkable because I think the empirical evidence in support of something like the middle income trap, I think, is quite weak. It's not like we don't think that it's difficult to go from middle income to high income. I mean, there are the kind of institutional changes that Daron has described here and written so much about. Those are absolutely difficult and require fundamental transformational change. But at least some of the evidence suggests that economies that grew fast at lower levels of income also tend to grow faster at middle income. And that suggests that there may be some kind of transformational capacities that economies have, and coming from transformational pressure or ability of institutions and structures to adjust. And what I think we should, when we analyze Kazakhstan, we should look at, how can we strengthen those transformational pressures? And because, as Daron said, when you have a resource economy, it becomes a lot more difficult to change structures and changing institutions. So that's the first one. The second one is really what everyone talks about, the new normal. I mean, the slowdown in growth in China, the recession in Russia, the oil prices, and the global slowdown in general. So I think that's something that you have to deal with. The last one, which I think is, again, looking at, depending on where you're looking at it from, is the Belt and Road or One Belt, One Road, which is, of course, on the one hand, an enormous opportunity, but it's also very serious risks in terms of new dependencies and lack of transparency, and so on. So if you look at those sort of three challenges, I think there are like three ways in which you can, or three sort of policy responses. So, and the first one is what the Kazakh government has already done, which is leave exchange rate targeting and move towards inflation targeting, because it is actually a way to take it's a possibility to take away a very major source of lack of transparency and corruption in the economy, but it also sends in transformational signals into the economy, very critical for change. The second one, which is maybe a little bit more, how should I say, it's not so immediate that this is important, but it's this notion of Astana as an international center, international financial center. Well, that sounds like maybe a pie in the sky and something, it's very far away. But actually, when you start thinking about it a little bit more deeply, it's actually, to get something like that, as a very ultimate vision, you need to have in place all those institutions that Daron talked about. But you also need to think in a very broad sense about quality of life and what will attract talented people to come to Kazakhstan and get Kazakh citizens who went abroad to study to come back and so on. All those things are incredibly important objectives, and they're part of that. The final thing is, I think, is just in general, this bottom-up transparency, openness, allowing signals from the population to come in to, when I talk to Kazakh about healthcare, when I talk about education, particularly secondary education and basic university education, there is so much discontent, and finding ways of getting those pressures into the system, I think, are critical.
I think there's an interesting link between the financial sector and diversification, which is, more general point about the sophistication of the economy. And the Prime Minister in his opening remarks mentioned Australia and Canada as two countries that Kazakhstan was looking at, and they're quite informative, I think, as to why they are still doing both of them fairly well, especially if we compared them, say, to Brazil and South Africa, which sort of have a similar export mix. And I guess I might think that one reason they're doing better is because they've got these sophisticated services sectors that aren't important just in their own right, but having a sophisticated financial centre in Australia, for example, or in Canada, means their mining sector can be more productive, even though neither are really international financial centres.
So I think broadly said, yes. I think it's a lot easier to deal with a sort of resource boom if you have basic institutions in place first. And I think there's actually a very good illustration of this from a recent history in Kazakhstan. When the global financial crisis hit, it hit Kazakhstan almost before any other country in the world. It was in a sense, a massive diversification that had happened through the financial system, but it was a diversification that happened without the framework for controlling, supervising the banks, making sure that the regulation was effective and that the risks were under control and so on. So that I think is an example of where you did diversification. You didn't have the basic institutions in place, and you made a catastrophe that Kazakhstan still is suffering from. So again, you need institutions in place to support those structural changes in the economy.
Because it shows us that diversification is not a one-way bet. It can also cause some problems. Antonio, so you've thought a lot about competitiveness of different countries in this region, and I guess already today we have started talking about certain sectors we think might be interesting. The Prime Minister mentioned manufacturing. In the panel this morning we talked about food and agriculture. This is a very old debate. Should the government come in and choose three sectors and pump them up? Or should they just do broad-based improvements to the business environment and let the market decide? Where do you stand on that?
Thank you for this question, which opens actually a much wider topic, which is, I'm a policymaker. I want to start diversify, and I won't speak about the merits of diversification. I guess it's already been discussed previously. But where do I start from? And there are some basic questions, including this one, some very basic questions that should be addressed in order to proper go into diversification without picking sectors which are not necessarily the right ones. First point is, on the basics, what should diversification be based on? The answer to that is easy, endowments. So in Kazakhstan, I have oil, I already pump oil, maybe I could diversify onto petrochemicals. I have a lot of land, agriculture and agribusiness, right? Not necessarily. The question is that there must be a match between my endowments and what I can do with those endowments as a country and the demand for those products, services that will be produced in my country. Therefore, the answer to this question is how big, how far, and how sustainable is the demand for those products that I can produce based on my endowments. Second part of the answer is also which are the endowments that should be looked at when thinking about diversification. Natural endowments seem to be the easy, immediate answer, and most of the times they are also right answer. There are much softer endowments, like the quality of human resources, like the ability of the people to become entrepreneurs, the geographic position and therefore ability to reach that potential demand for the goods and services that are produced. This should also be taken into the picture. Mm-hmm. Well, I have many other questions that I would ask myself as a policymaker, but maybe later.
Just going to pause for a moment and see if anybody from the audience would like to ask any of the panel members a question. If there's nothing straight away, I'm going to ask each of the panel's thoughts on sustainability, and I don't mean environmental sustainability necessarily, but how do you make a transition sustainable in the long term? We had the example of the finance sector. There was some sort of diversification, but that ended up not being a long-term kind of fix. Maybe what can we do to make sure that it lasts for the long term? Darren, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric's already sort of touched on this, and I want to sort of build on his answer. You know, I think there is all this discussion of the middle income trap, and as Eric says, you know, when you look at the evidence, it's a little tenuous, that if you look very hard, you can find something that looks like a middle income trap, but statistically, sometimes it happens at $10,000 per capita, $10,000 per capita, sometimes 20,000, sometimes it happens as a growth slowdown. And that part of the reason for that is I think there's a lot of heterogeneity in what the institutional structure and the comparative advantage of the different countries are. But I think a slightly different way of looking at the problem might be more illuminating, and let's call that a middle institutional trap, which is that, you know, you have countries that grow what James and I called in Why Nations Failed, extractive growth model, through an extractive growth model. An extractive growth model is a sort of a top-down growth model that either exploits some well-established comparative advantage of an economy, such as an agricultural product or a natural resources, or it heavily builds on importing technology from the already existing world technology frontier through large corporations or government support, essentially, you know, what China has been doing extremely well over the last 25 years or so. But the general presumption, I think supported with quite a bit of evidence that we try to sort of push, is that this extractive growth model cannot last because it doesn't really mobilize the broad-based skills, talents, creativity of the population, and does not lead to innovation, technological progress, productivity growth, and so on, to the extent that a country is truly capable of generating. So therefore, a big question is how to transition from an experience of extractive growth to a more sustainable, inclusive growth, and that's where the sustainability comes crucially in. And I think if you look at, for example, the current Chinese experience, it's a great success of what we would call extractive growth, but it's one that is very cognizant of the challenges. You know, the current Chinese leadership is trying to sort of have its cake and eat it too, invest a lot in technology, innovation, universities, research, in order to be able to kickstart that process of innovative growth without really letting the reins go from an institutional point of view. But I think we're going to see how that sort of how that experience works out. But generally speaking, the transition of going from extractive growth to a more inclusive growth process is a difficult one, and that's the one that I would like to think of as the middle institutional trap, because institutionally countries are trapped in a given growth model with all of its trappings, which generally includes the corruption that comes with it, the political institutions that come with it, that feed of that system, the people who actually benefit from it, both in the business world and in the political and the bureaucratic world. So all of these sort of surrounding factors make it very difficult for a country to just change its institutional model and start supporting a more open economic structure. So that middle income or middle institutional trap need not happen at a given level of income per capita. It really depends on, whether an economy was based on a single natural resource, such as like the Middle Eastern countries, or has had an extractive growth experience like the one in China, based on technology imports and really technologically very advanced corporations within the broader Chinese economy. But I think it has some very common elements, and it needs to have an institutional solution. And I think that's the umbrella that, the conceptual umbrella that I would like to think through about these general changes. So looked at it that way, I think the problem of Kazakhstan is extremely different from that of China, but it also has similarities. And in that respect, trying to build both the supporting institutions that will make sure that the economy has the capability, society has the capability to resolve very difficult conflicts, contain instability, create a home for different people to have voices, both in the economic life and in the political sphere, is an absolute necessity. But on the other hand, you also need to create a broadly free environment for all of these voices to be able to to come to the fore at some level. So those are, I think, the really difficult parts to make fit, and both it is just a very difficult problem for it to work out, even when people have the political will to do it. But of course, there's generally going to be a conservatism and unwillingness to let some of these processes, because it's difficult, it's risky, and it will also eat into the rents of some of the businesses and some of the politicians.
Like Poland, Hungary, were based on their experience in the European Union and the effect that the European Union had on their institutions. And my question is for Kazakhstan, what do you think will be the impact of institutions of Eurasian Economic Union, those institutions on Kazakhstan, and how it will affect our growth in short term and long term? Thank you.
Antonio, maybe if you take that one from the Eurasia perspective.
Thank you. Actually, affiliation of a country to a union or an international organization is not the end, it's the beginning. And the way that the country uses its affiliation and the rules and regulations of the affiliation can help a lot, in fact, the reform process. Now, to your question specifically, what happened in several Central European countries, the ones you mentioned, which are today members both of the European Union and the OECD as well, is that they made their general economic growth and their diversification, they made them sustainable. How? By doing three things. One is involving heavily the small medium enterprise sector, which means small and medium enterprise policy, but also competition policy, but also proper liberalization and privatization, so that they have created a space for small medium enterprises to thrive. And that's very important for several reasons. One, because they make these small medium enterprises make the country more resilient. And two, because they are the most democratic form of economic growth. The wealth is automatically distributed through the profit. Second, they've involved heavily the foreign direct investors, which have brought quality FDI, meaning money, but also knowledge, expertise, and most importantly is knowledge transfer in the country. And third, they have heavily used the public-private dialogue in their reforms. Therefore, on the one hand, communicating properly what they were doing so that the citizens would understand. On the other hand, getting the proper feedback from the ultimate users of the reforms. What I'm trying to get at is that diversification per se, or adhering to Eurasian Economic Union or WTO or other unions, in isolation will not do. Countries that have made good or excellent progress is because they have had a coordinated, holistic approach to all the economic growth.
Eric, you had a comment as well.
Just three very quick points. The first one, most of the changes in institutions in Central and Eastern Europe happened before countries became members of the European Union. So there is this outside anchor effect that's so important. The second point is that there are benefits from the Eurasian Economic Union in terms of getting rid of trade barriers, maybe some standardization and so on. So there are benefits. But if you're looking for this sort of institutional impact of the Eurasian Economic Union, it's not so obvious, because what happened in the EU case was that you had an approximation to the higher standards of the EU, while if you look at the differences, they are almost the same institutions, by most measures at least. Russia and Kazakhstan and Belarus is another story. So I don't see that impact of the Eurasian Economic Union.
And a popular question, I'm going to bring Darren in as well.
So I mean, Eric said exactly what I wanted to say, plus one other thing, which is that the EU reforms, so the EU accession process not only worked on the economic part, but on the political part. I think the two of them going together was really transformative for most of them. And it's still a difficult thing. You see Hungary now, it hasn't been able to, that's one case which has not worked out, and there is no guarantee of success. But when you look at all these other economic unions, they almost always lack the political aspect. And in fact, some of their political models are exactly the wrong models. So even though the economic integration is a benefit, I am quite fearful that the political aspect might go the wrong way.
My name is Vladimir. I'm from Halik Finance company. And my question, I believe it will be a bit theoretical. So coming back to previous speech of Mr. Asemoglu, we now face that the institutional model of the government, which used to cover previously just one-way revenue coming to government, like from oil in our case. So, and now the model should be changed for diversified economy. So it's, and Mr. Asemoglu told that it will be a very tough scenario. So isn't it will be more effective for the government to switch to one other source of revenue, for example, from oil to transportation and logistics, and to develop just or just one source and one industry, and also along with it, so a little bit with less space, diversify to the other industries. I mean, instead of going like all the ways at once.
Алихан Талгатбек, член Совета директоров Баян-Сулу, представитель производственного сектора Казахстана. У меня такой вопрос. На сегодняшний день все производственники испытывают большие проблемы с финансированием. Это высокая процентная ставка и отсутствие длинных денег. В то же время, как мы знаем, в европейских странах, в развитых странах на сегодняшний день очень низкие ставки по кредитам. То есть, если мы получаем кредиты под 18 годовых, то там получают по 3 годовых. То есть изначально мы находимся в неравноправных конкурентных условиях. В этой связи, каковы ваши рекомендации для улучшения ситуации? И как вы прокомментируете текущую ситуацию?
So this is a huge, the first question is a huge issue sort of among the economists. So I probably belong to those who think that there are things you can do at the sector level. I don't believe you should go one sector at a time, but I think it is sometimes useful to think about specific sector strategies. It has to do with specific financing issues in some sector, specific human capital issues, special training. I think that's where government can really help. I think also fostering competition in individual sectors is hugely important, and sometimes fostering transparency around corporate governance and so on. So I think these things can be done sector by sector, but I would be very scared of putting all your eggs in one basket and thinking that somehow you can push through. At least I think the evidence there is not very encouraging. The second question again was
the interest rate differential between Kazakhstan and the rest of the world. So very low interest rates in the OECD, basically, expected to continue. Very high rates here.
Yeah, I mean, interest rates are a function of the business environment, the fiscal policies, the monetary policies. It's obviously it's a challenge to get the economy going with the current interest rate. There's no question about that. But it's not obvious that you can do very much about that at the moment, I think. But maybe someone else wants to.
I guess the world has a whole lot of excess savings. Looking for a home, so maybe that differential could be viewed potentially
but
as a plus
these
point.
interest rates, they reflect risks, and there are some considerable risks here. So I don't, because I'm very worried about encouraging people to take all their savings to Kazakhstan. I mean, it would be potentially good for Kazakhstan, but I think there is some risk associated.
At the EIU, we're forecasting a slight currency appreciation in 2017, so I reckon you should do it. Darren.
No, I mean, I think I agree with Eric on both questions. I think there are two aspects to the first question. I think one is investment, and I think there Eric's already sort of gave the answer. I would be even more on the side of the government should be not necessarily picking winners, but trying to create a broad environment. Of course, there is, for Kazakhstan, technology transfer is a major issue, and the government does have a role in facilitating technology transfers via a variety of means, and that might be much more important in some sectors than others. The second aspect, however, is the public finances. So, when you look at many developing countries that are facing similar problems of transitioning to a more modern productivity, technology-based economic growth, they also have the big challenge of having very little state capacity to provide for the tax revenues and that will be necessary for infrastructure, education, healthcare. And I think there, Kazakhstan has a big advantage that it does not have the same sort of public finance problem. But of course, as the economy diversifies, the source of the public finance will hopefully shift, and having the government financed by an income tax, at least to some degree, which of course is the rule in most OECD economies, but quite rare in many developing countries, is very important, because when people actually pay taxes, they become more of a claim holder and stakeholder in the political decisions of how all those monies are spent. So if you have an economy, and again, the Middle East is the best case and worst case example for this, when the government finances are entirely fueled by, say, oil revenues, then this sort of link between people acting as citizens, participating in the political process about how that money should be spent, is sort of severe, and it makes the whole political transitions harder. So in some sense, modernizing the public finances is also part of the broader economic and political development process.
Antonio, do you have any comments to add?
Well, also a couple of comments. One is that the last question calls for another overall question that as a policymaker one could take into account, which is, should I tap large and reform my business environment and let the market choose what the proper sectors are for diversification, or should I somewhat either pick winners or facilitate some of the sector, removing barriers there? And the answer is that probably, unfortunately, it's both. Meaning that there are some issues which are, of course, economy-wide. If the interest rates are high, this is an economy-wide issue, should be taken care of regardless. In other cases, for example, some infrastructural issues, especially for a big and empty country like Kazakhstan, might be more sector focused. Therefore, just to be practical, that railway or that road I build where I need, not a complete full infrastructure in all the countries where it might end up being empty. The last thing I want to say, because I'm not sure I will have a chance to speak again, is that all we are saying here, by the way, is not enough. And it's not enough for the very simple reason that the government can do whatever they want, but in the end, what will make the economy diversify is the existence of business cases. And business cases are healthy and can be effective when they come from the private sector. So I would like to finish from where I started, which is big involvement of the private sector in any reform effort, including and especially on diversification, is key for its success. Thank you.
Well, that was a very prescient comment, because indeed we have come to the end of this session, and our next session is going to focus on the investor side. So asking, what are investors going to be doing for these opportunities in Kazakhstan. So thanks very much to my panel, Darren Asimoglu, Eric Berthoff, and Antonio Sommer. Please join me in thanking them.